Dr. Lisa Murray is our speaker for this afternoon, and I'd like to extend a very warm welcome to you. Lisa, as City of Sydney historian, she joined the City of Sydney History Programme in 2001. She's written widely on cemeteries and cultural landscapes in New South Wales. Lisa is currently working on a social and industrial history of the southern city area and is a member of the Professional Historians Association of New South Wales. In addition to her role as city historian, Lisa is chair of the Board of Trustees for the Dictionary of Sydney. Lisa's topic today is local history, making connections in the digital age. As you can probably guess, it's digital. Okay, welcome Lisa, and thank you very much.
I'd like to, Phil's just going to be setting up some things, and thanks for turning off the lights, that's great. I just want to say thank you very much for inviting me to speak today. As Liz mentioned in her presidential report, I did say to her that I think the Glebe Society is one of the most active groups that we have in the City of Sydney local government area, and the way that you focus on so many different things. You know, you are a social group, a historical society, a family history group, an environmental group, a heritage group, and the way that you delegate tasks out and you really work together with the community, I think is really admirable. And I was really pleased to come along and hear all the awards and commendations that have been given today, and it just shows how actively involved you are as a group, and I think that's wonderful. So congratulations to you all, and keep up the good work. I just want to quickly show you a little tiny video, and then we're going to, I'll go into my talk proper. So I'll just get this up.
They sailed these boats, they built them themselves out of the scraps and leftovers of other boats.
You came down past St Mary's, up William Street through King's Cross.
Between 1841 and 1886, it was Sydney's principal Catholic orphanage.
The Strand was built in 1891. It was the last of the 19th century arcades to be built in Sydney.
See, Redfern, this is where the civil rights movement first started.
They moved the settlement penal colony to Parramatta, to that location.
Okay, so today I just wanted to have a chat to you about local history and making connections in the digital age. As a public historian, I've always been interested in local history and how it connects with the sort of wider historical narrative. Now, with the flourishing of the internet, there are whole new ways we can share our history, find out new information, and make connections. But how is the digital humanities revolutionising history at a local and national level? Today I want to reflect upon this new area of historical production that is part of the digital humanities. What does digital history mean for local and community history? What does it mean for groups like the Glebe Society? And particularly, how do we research it and produce history? And what impact can it have on our broader historical understandings? Now, as many of you would know, and as Murray actually introduced me, I'm involved in this fantastic community public history project called the Dictionary of Sydney. And it is a born digital history project, conceived as a freely available resource presenting scholarship on all of metropolitan Sydney's history. Now, a purely digital history, I think, redefines the possibilities for urban history and public history. And using the Dictionary of Sydney as a case study and drawing on a few examples from the Glebe area, I want to share with you some of the ways that I think local history is taking on a much greater significance in historiography in the digital age. Now, it sounds like a pretty heavy topic maybe for a Sunday morning, but I think it's particularly relevant to you as the Glebe Society because you know, you are actually already moving into the digital age and kind of grappling with these issues. You've repackaged and launched your Glebe Walks online, which is a wonderful project that was launched earlier in the year. And I know that you are discussing and looking at your website and how you can update it. So I think that the opportunities for the digital history are exciting. And I hope you too will be invigorated by the possibilities the digital humanities is throwing up for ways of presenting Glebe's history. So a couple of years back, American scholars Seedfeld and Thomas actually published a review of this new area of historiography. And in an article called What is Digital History, they made a distinction between three different genres or types of digital history. Firstly, there's sort of digitisation projects, and probably the most outstanding example of that in Australia is all of the work done by the National Library of Australia with Trove, digitising newspapers across Australia, making them accessible to everyone through the computers. The second type of digital history there is are presentation layers, and something like the Glebe Walks is a perfect example of that, where you're actually taking the digital technology and using it to present history in a new way and making it more accessible. And then the third type of digital history that they discuss is new model scholarship. And what they mean by that is where digital technologies are actually used to visualise history in new ways, develop new research questions, and undertake historical analysis in new ways. And I think I would argue that the Dictionary of Sydney is certainly a blend of the second and third types of digital history. So it's both a form of digital publication, but it's also a type of new model scholarship using digital technologies to visualise history in new ways. So it's an innovative mix of history and technology, and it connects people, place and time, and it provides a unifying framework for telling diverse stories of Sydney's history and culture with multiple authors and potentially contested interpretations. But why do digital history? What are the benefits and what can it do for local history? Well, I think there are five major ways that digital history can actually transform history. Firstly, liberation from the page. Then there's connectivity, collaboration, community and innovation. And so I'd just like to move through those and talk to you a bit about them and how it sort of affects how we might write about our history. Well, I think most of us would agree that there are some tangible benefits of digital history, and these benefits do arise because we are moving away from the printed page. In the world of digital history, There can be fewer restrictions on word length. Now, some might say that's not a good thing, but others would say, yes, it is. And I think one of the things is that with digital history, because it's being, if you take it to getting it published, say, on the web, then you are able to actually publish detailed pieces that are really aimed at niche audiences. But because you're not reliable necessarily on people finding out about the book and buying the book, but they might be actually searching for it on the web, you can actually reach a much greater audience. And it can still be a niche audience, but they might be around the world. And so this actually allows us to write about history in different ways and share our history in a different way. And I think that's a good move forward. Excitingly, there is no limit on illustrations. And they can be seen in glorious colour and delivered in high resolution, so that every detailed element can be appreciated in illustration. And for any of you who have been involved in publishing history at all, of course, illustrations is one of the things with books and journal articles. It's expensive and it's hard, and often they're in black and white. So obviously the opportunities that things like the internet provide us for providing more illustrations is very exciting. And of course, through digital technologies, the range of sources that can be effectively presented is also widening. So digital history can also make the most of audio-visual sources. Oral histories and archival film footage can be included. And also digital technologies allow for things like time-spatial mapping, and geographical information can be used to chart places and buildings on maps and link them to a timeline. You can overlay historical maps onto contemporary maps and make them transparent, zoom them in. So these sorts of things really allow us to visualise history and present history in different ways. So I think that they're some of the kind of the benefits from moving beyond the page. Another astoundingly simple but exciting element, I think, of the digital humanities is connectivity. So encyclopedias have always presented disparate material with cross-references, and historians are always sort of shifting through stuff and making connections in different ways. And of course, indexes in books also provide connections, but obviously only within one book. But in the digital age, we can link across articles and we can link across the world. So each piece of information can become suspended in a web of connections. Family history gets connected to the bigger urban picture, and historical networks of families, businesses and communities come alive through these connections. And I think connectivity is actually changing both the way historians write and how history is produced. If you're going to be writing for a digital history project, you will be writing in a slightly different way. By linking apparently disparate articles through a name or a place in a project like the Dictionary of Sydney, facts can be cross-referenced or triangulated and discrepancies brought to light. But more importantly, many new references have become accessible through digitisation projects without spending months in libraries. And this actually allows whole new lines of historical inquiry to open up and be easily pursued. Research from 20 or 30 years ago is only enhanced, I think, by the modern research methodologies that are enabled by digitisation projects. And I think this is one of the exciting opportunities for the digital humanities. It's not just the new historical areas we can go through, but actually to revisit the research that we've been doing over the past 20 and 30 years and actually say, okay, well, now this digitisation project has happened, or now I can search for this, in all those catalogues overseas that I've never had access to before. What other information is out there, and how can I revisit this historical research? Another outcome of digital history is unexpected connections. Cross-references and connections in time and space actually emerge that are unknown to all or maybe even any of the authors involved. Let me give you an example. This is the way of the amalgamation, and linking of articles in digital humanities can make these new connections and bring scholarship into new contexts. We have an article in the Dictionary of Sydney, and it was about the Garrison Church in Millers Point, and it identified Edward Flood as the builder. And when we created Flood's person entity listing, we also drew on biographical information that was published on the City of Sydney's website and on the New South Wales Parliament websites, because Flood was the Mayor of Sydney and he was also a Member of Parliament. So already we had one particular article, and then we were drawing on other research that had been published elsewhere and we were putting it together. Then an article about sport was submitted, and it mentioned that Edward Flood was also a founding member of the Australian Cricket Club. Now, the sporting historian and the architectural historian may not have necessarily been interested in these two connections. And in fact, they may not have even been aware of them, because obviously they were focused in on their area of research. But for the local historian, the political historian, the social historian, even the family historian, these connections that we've been able to make may provide the aha moment to suddenly reimagine what Edward Flood is doing in certain circumstances. What does this mean for the way history is produced? Well, because historical text is always written with a purpose in mind, writers do edit for relevance. So the person writing about sport is only interested in Edward Flood because he's associated with the Australian Cricket Club. But a family connection, for instance, that a writer deems to be irrelevant or does not mention, will still actually be present in a historical model like the Dictionary of Sydney, because we're not only interested in Edward Flood and his relationship to sport, but we will also define him as a community member and a person who has a lot of different relationships and connections. And so by actually opening up not just a historical article, but also but providing the kind of factual information behind who the person was and how he fits into Sydney's community, it may actually inspire new questions of the history of sport, or new questions about Flood's role in politics, given he had an interest in sport as well. So I think in the digital humanities, the historical model that underlies sort of major digital history projects, the means of, and when I say the historical model, it's like the means of making these connections and visualising the scholarship in new ways. This actually contributes to our historical understanding, and it's actually shaping and connecting the overall product that's being produced. Collaboration. By its very nature, the digital humanities feed off and build upon other digital projects. So the Dictionary of Sydney benefits from and is highly reliant upon many other digital history projects, such as the Australian Dictionary of Biography online. Now, that was always available in volumes, and a lot of our libraries had them. And certainly you'd go and consult them. But to be able to have those readily available online for everyone to use and to link to makes a really big difference in the work that we do for the Dictionary of Sydney. And of course, the one I mentioned before, but I just so love it, is the digitised newspapers online on Trove. And also just the way Trove generally, as a catalogue, you can focus in on a particular source like newspapers or maps or whatever, or you can do a consolidated search across all different areas and across multiple libraries across Australia, which is just mind-blowing. Like, if only they were doing that when I was at university. That's all I say. It would have been so good. I wouldn't have spent half my time in the library. I would have been out there doing other sorts of research. It really is transforming the way we're doing research. And projects like the Dictionary of Sydney wouldn't get even, we wouldn't be able to do nearly as much as what we're doing already if it wasn't for these sorts of projects. So, the thing there is that now there is a critical mass of digital history projects out there that allow these sort of encyclopedic and hypertext annotated ambitions like the Dictionary of Sydney a reality. And in this sense, I think we should see that the Dictionary of Sydney is just a collaborative project amongst many other projects in the digital humanities. And of course, the Dictionary of Sydney itself is a collaborative project, being involved with a whole lot of different research and financial partners. And I suppose I can't go on without acknowledging a few of those. The City of Sydney has been extremely supportive. The council has invested money in getting the research project off the ground, and now the Dictionary of Sydney is running as its own cultural organisation. The City of Sydney has committed another 4 years funding, and so in this financial year they're contributing $250,000 to keep developing the Dictionary of Sydney, and that's obviously the vision of the City of Sydney Council in providing that support is great, and I'd like to acknowledge that. But we have a lot of other research partners as well, including the University of Sydney, the University of Technology Sydney, the Historic Houses Trust and the Powerhouse Museum, State Records New South Wales and the State Library of New South Wales have all been research partners on major grants that we've combined together to get this project underway. So we're interested in partnerships with all sorts of cultural organisations and groups. And I think one of the really good things about digital humanities projects is that they are forcing cultural institutions to look harder at their websites and their catalogues and their connectivity with digital histories. So when we set up the Dictionary of Sydney, we created it from the start with what we called persistent identifiers, which means that we will always have the same web address for all our entries and all our people, and it'll always stay the same. And one of the problems with a lot of cultural institutions with their catalogues when they first went up online was that they were drawing off a database, and so they didn't have a persistent identifier to be able to link to things. And so a lot of the cultural institutions were playing catch-up. For example, 5 years ago, the State Library didn't have persistent identifiers in their catalogues, so we could use an image from the State Library's catalogue, but we couldn't provide a direct link straight back always to that image. Because they just didn't have that technology in place. So a lot of groups are playing catch-up here. The State Library now have got persistent identifiers, so we're going back and putting all of those links back in so that you can always go back to the source and see where we're getting information from. And, these sorts of exercises take time, and digital projects aren't cheap, but it's good to know that finally, after literally years and years and years and years of lobbying, the Mitchell Library, which is part of the State Library of New South Wales, has finally got money to go back through the last, its card catalogue and be able to enter all of that into their online catalogue. And that, again, will be a huge boon for all of us historians when we're doing our research. Once that all gets online, that will just be amazing. The digital humanities also use collaboration of authors, and this goes way beyond the edited book or encyclopedia. Now, perhaps the most open example of this is Wikipedia, which uses a radical trust of Web 2 engagement to write and develop all of their content. So everyone can contribute, everyone can correct mistakes, but there's no authorship acknowledged or attributed, and the article changes with each edition and correction. A slightly more conservative approach to authorship in the digital humanities is what's called a shared authority process, and this is the way that the Dictionary of Sydney is going. Content production for the Dictionary of Sydney is collaborative, cross-disciplinary volunteer effort. Essays and entries are commissioned by the Dictionary of Sydney Trust, but unsolicited content, feedback and suggestions are also encouraged, heavily encouraged, and both kinds of entries are flowing in. Historians, archaeologists, heritage specialists, historical societies, experts, enthusiasts, amateurs. All of them are writing for the dictionary, and all of you should be as well. But what I think is really interesting is that a shared authority model of authorship actually draws upon a lot of the more traditional scholarship standards that historians have generally adhered to, and basically takes them and places them into a digital environment. So, for example, in the Dictionary of Sydney, all the entries are actually attributed to authors whose expertise, experience and knowledge is cited. Entries are also dated as well, and all entries are persistent. So some small modifications might be made to correct a dramatic error, but the entry as a piece will remain on the dictionary, even if another article is written about the same subject in 5 years' time. And it stays there along with all its endnotes and references. And this provides, I think, a stamp of authority and veracity that is sometimes lacking in the digital environment. You think, how many times have you gone onto a website and the information seems good, and then you look around and you go, well, who's actually writing this, and how can I trust this source, and what do I know about this organisation that's actually publishing it? Well, that's one of the things that we wanted to do with the Dictionary of Sydney as a digital history project, was actually say, well, we understand the importance of research and the author's voice, and we want to make that quite clear in what we're doing. And we want to acknowledge that lots of people have expertise, but also that there are different interpretations. So the Dictionary of Sydney has a guide for contributors to ensure that there's obviously some consistency of style and content, but the authorial voice is allowed to shine through. So some of our pieces are quite scholarly, others are more conversational in tone, and some have a more literary or arty approach to a subject. Now, such an approach would be much more difficult if we were looking at a print publication. Most publishers of larger you think of something like the Oxford Companion to Australian History, or even something like the Australian Dictionary of Biography. They have quite a consistent tone across all of their articles, whereas the Dictionary of Sydney is very much more interested in actually allowing that kind of variety and diversity of expression. So we deliberately acknowledge our authors, and we want to encourage and cultivate multiple voices. And we think, this is part of the project's commitment to public history with contributions from all parts of our community. So, community history, the local and the global. I want to talk a bit about community, particularly in relation to the globalisation of community history. So a project like the Dictionary has some really exciting possibilities, I think, for connecting the huge interest in family history and local history with Sydney's urban and social history. Through the historical model and navigational structures of the dictionary, the fine-grained and the detailed local history can be juxtaposed within a city-wide, national and global perspective. And I think what's really interesting is the way that all of these connections are made quite explicit in the way that local history can sort of connect to thematic history. It's really loud and clear. So if we browse through the entries, the entities and the hypertext annotations and links in the Dictionary of Sydney, we can quickly discover that Glebe is specifically mentioned in annotations. Up there we can see we've got an aerial sort of view, and we've got a definition of a map that you can zoom in and out. If you click on, you can see there's Glebe demographics there. You can go through. We've got the demographics from the 2001 and 2006 census material, and when all the stats become available from the census we've just done, once all the ABS has done all the grinding, and then we've got ID people to actually break that down by suburb, that will all be available in the Dictionary of Sydney. But if we keep scrolling down, as well as all the pictures and things you can see are already in there to do with Glebe, we've got mentioned in, and you can see all the things that Glebe gets mentioned in. So it's mentioned in literature, an entry on the economy, one on planning. That won't surprise you. I mean, that's how the Glebe Society started, wasn't it? But it's mentioned in religion and tourism and immigration and transport. And it's mentioned in education, it's mentioned in education and charity and philanthropy. It's mentioned in the Green Bands movement. And it's even mentioned in an article on bricks. So connections you might not have thought of, Glebe suddenly gets a mention. And of course there's specific references to people and places in Glebe, and they too get connected more broadly to Sydney's history. Max Solling has written an article on the history of Glebe as a suburb, and that will be published later this year, and that no doubt will add a whole lot more new connections all through Sydney's history. And you can't quite see it, I should have scrolled down further, but below, after mentioned in, there's external links, and the Dictionary of Sydney has provided a link back to the Glebe walks, so that people can, anyone in Sydney or Australia or the world who's going around the dictionary and gets interested in Glebe can come in and then come across as well. So we make those connections between different groups and the history and the work that's being done. The dictionary also has this really interesting potential to connect family history, much of which is very place-based, into the city's broader urban history, and family relationships that shape things of, power, inheritance, property, influence, all of this sort of thing can be modelled and connected into larger narratives of politics and development in Sydney. And George Allen is an obvious example here. As we know, he was a patriarch of the Allen family, owned the Toxteth estate, first solicitor trained entirely in Australia, founder of one of Sydney's oldest law firms. But he was also involved in both municipal and state politics. He was also passionate about education, and he was involved in the School of the Arts movement. And so he, in fact, gets a mention in a quite large thematic essay on the School of Arts movement. And he was also a founder of the Sydney Free Public Grammar School. So these connections can all be illustrated in the dictionary through timelines and occupations and positions, as well as through individual articles. And I think this is a really new way of thinking about how we present history. It's not just about the article that we write, it's also about the connections. And to me, that's actually one of the great benefits of a digital history project like the Dictionary of Sydney, that we can actually start to represent the complicated relationships that actually make up a community. And we can actually start communicating that to other people. Who knew whom? Who was related to whom? How many times have you done some research into a person and you actually find that, the businessman, their son marries the daughter of a businessman in the same area. So they're consolidating their business interests as well as their family interests, and part of the reason might be because that tradespeople or that business, they actually also socialise together. So you're building up a picture of a community and how they interact. And I think this, it's these connections that is actually what makes communities tick. How, if we were writing the history of the Glebe Society in another 20 years, how would we be describing all these people? You all have different, you all live in and around Glebe, or have in the past, but also, what are your business interests? Where are you? And how does that connect? And because of that connection, do you then get dragged into doing something else over there? Well, that's the sort of thing that we can start with a complicated historical model like this. Digital history projects allow that sort of thing to be kind of mapped out and visualised and shared with other people. It's not just complicated little notes and things in a vertical file. We can actually make this and present it to other people. And this is obviously another area which, in terms of for community history, is so important that digital history projects like the Dictionary of Sydney, and there's lots of others out there, that is actually opening up avenues for publication. And this is actually fostering local history and community history. Already, entries that have been written for the dictionary are appearing on other council websites and other historical society websites. And that's partly because the licensing system enables authors to reuse their content. And similarly, if an author was a Glebe, there's no reason why any of the content that's been written, for instance, for the Glebe Society's bulletin, couldn't also be written up and published on the Dictionary of Sydney. The benefit of publishing on something like the Dictionary of Sydney, as well as in your society's publication or on your society's website, is that the material gets caught in the web of Sydney's broader historical connections and becomes part of Greater Sydney's story. So the digital humanities are encouraging innovation in historical writing and in historical research methodologies. I think what we're finding really interesting is in the historical model we have, we're really interested in place, in all the suburbs, in where people lived, where businesses were, georeferencing that and putting it in both time and space. So you're locating a business in a place, but also in time, and you can map that. So being specific about when and where things happened. And it's amazing, local historians, groups like the Glebe Society are really good at that. But talking to some academic historians who are used to thinking about the big picture, it's actually forcing them to write in a new way. And what it's really doing is that it's actually privileging local history. So local history is once again becoming quite a strong force, I think, and it will become an even greater force in social history and urban history. We're also now a highly visual culture, and the presentation of digital history is really encouraging historians to be much more visually fluent in their historical analysis and in their writing. There is an expectation in digital history that it will be richly illustrated, and this will gradually lead historians to include visual cultures as part of their source material. And of course, the same can be said for audio and for film. The expanding nature of digital history projects, where information can be added and connected forever and ever, will contribute to innovation of new historical research questions, historical analysis, and methodological approaches. In the case of the dictionary, as the relationships between people and places become richer and more complex, we will be able to actually query the Dictionary of Sydney itself and sort things by type or relationship or year or area, and so hopefully discover new relationships and patterns that can be mapped out and further analysed. And over the time, the layering of articles will document the changing interpretation of a subject. And in the very long term, as the layers increase, it will actually document the historiography of the subject. So at the moment, one example is that we've got an article on Hyde Park Barracks, and that's a broad history of the Hyde Park Barracks. Now we've got another article on the Hyde Park Barracks, which is specifically about the archaeology and what they found there. And in another 10 years' time, there might be another article about the Hyde Park Barracks because it's no longer a museum and it's some other form of use, and people might be looking at the rise and fall of the museum at the Hyde Park Barracks or something like that. And all of those can be added on and kept within the same sort of historical web of connections. And so as digital history projects become bigger and more complex, they basically become a source of historical inquiry in their own right. Now, Dr. Stephen Ramsey, who's a digital humanities specialist at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln in the United States of America, he argues that the digital humanities are actually also dramatically changing the whole methodology of our consumption of information. And it's probably no surprise that really the proliferation of hypertext and connectivity, just linking from one thing to another, we've all done it, it encourages browsing. And that's why, our Internet Explorers are always called browsers, because you go in there and you do go into Google and you will type in, you might have something specific to look for, but then you probably do end up browsing around. In the very early days, they were calling it surfing. Remember when you used to surf the internet? I'm sure there's going to be a really interesting article that we write about the language of the internet and digital history projects and how that changes over time. So Ramsey, he doesn't call it browsing. He doesn't call it even surfing. He calls it screwing around. And I kind of like that too. Of course, the digital humanities allow for more powerful searching and research methods. But as Ramsey suggests, once you have access to vast amounts of information, and this is a quote, screwing around suddenly becomes a far more illuminating and useful activity. And I think, this is true. As the dictionary certainly gives readers and researchers the opportunity for meandering discovery. And in this type of digital history, there is no grand narrative. There's no defined pathway. There are multiple pathways, hypertext annotations and stories. And the multiple voices and authors in many digital history projects, I think, and particularly in the Dictionary of Sydney, can be seen as a reflection of the diversity of our community and our city itself, the places, the peoples, the history. So I think as local historians, we are living in exciting times. The digital humanities is transforming the way we research, the way we write, publish, and produce history. We have the opportunity to present local history in new ways that reflect our complex social networks. We can connect the local history of Glebe with Greater Sydney's history and the global historical context. This type of digital history, as Stephen Ramsey rightly concludes, is an invitation to community, to relationship, and to play. And I hope you accept the invitation to join the historiographical revolution, and I'll see you out there screwing around in the digital age.
Thank you very much, Lisa. I'm not sure about that last statement, but anyway, you have other things to attend to on the Glebe Society, I have to tell you. Don't get distracted. Our new Vice President, John Gray, will move a vote of thanks for Dr. Lisa Murray.
Thank you, Lisa.
Well, that was a very interesting talk, thank you. About 30 years ago, Margaret Thatcher rather breathily said, as she would, there is no society. There are individuals and families. And we've reaped the benefits of that sort of analysis, and we've seen them recently in London. What we heard here today from Dr. Lisa Murray was how important institutions are. I mean, she put a spin on it which was very much about the Given Project, but if you listen closely to what she was saying, it's about societies connecting with each other. And what's being provided through the Dictionary of Sydney is a remarkable access point, a portal as one would call it. I wrote down a few notes and I was trying to put it together in some order, but those of you who know me well know that my mind is not ordered. So I picked up some things, and that last phrase was one of them. The one phrase I thought really connected Lisa's work with what we do is these connections make communities tick. And I think connections do make communities tick. I was sitting a long way away from here looking at a website when I had decided I should get involved in the Glebe Society in an active role. And I looked on the website of the Glebe Society and I was absolutely knocked out with the quality of the submissions and the quality of the work that is done. It was so easy. I was in another country to do this, to find these things and to look at them and to make some comments. And I was quite struck at that opportunity. I hope it's an opportunity we can take up. When I knew I had to, I'd been invited to give the vote of thanks for Dr. Murray's work, I went onto the Dictionary of Sydney, as you do, and started browsing around, as you do, or screwing around, as I now I'm told. I should refer to, I'll come back to that particular point near the end. And I did notice Glebe. I noticed, of course, as you do, how you get trust in a website is that you pick a topic you know yourself fairly well, and you dive in there and you start reading it. So I started reading about the green bands, and I read about different projects. And I noticed some of the authors, people like Meredith Bergman and Verity Bergman had written, and you started to work from there. But I was particularly impressed, because I've always been worried about Wikipedia and things like it, on the notion of shared authority. And although it's an expensive project to mount a dictionary of Sydney in a digitised form, it also reduces its costs through having voluntary labour. But better than that, it makes another connection. And every time we make a connection, we improve the quality of our communities. And I think that's another point that's worth making. Can I do the more formal thing that one normally does and say, as the rapporteur, what did she say, as if you hadn't heard these things? I'll just pick up the major ones. Firstly, I've mentioned making connections. Secondly, redefining possibilities. I think it's incredibly important, incredibly wonderful to know that people can look at new research questions. I was staggered to hear Lisa complain about her days at university when she didn't have quite the access. May I tell you, madam, about my days at university? When one would walk into the Fisher Library and browse around the library and see people in the corner screwing around, as you said, and take notes from there. It is much better, it is much easier to be able to move around and redefine questions as you're working. There is a danger that redefinition can get you lost in a new miasma, but I know the people that we're working with here in this society don't have those problems. She mentioned the three major types of digital projects: digitisation, which we're now quite familiar with, and presentation, which we're now quite familiar with, and the new model scholarship. And the connection between the new model scholarship and presentation, I think, were the most significant. And the advantages, of course, were mentioned. The thing that I got in all of this is that there's a blurring of the line. There was one phrase she used which resonated with me. It was the aha moment. I come from a faculty of business at the University of Technology which talks about design thinking, and design thinking has what they call an aha moment. And it was when that aha moment came through to me, I thought, aha, what's happened here is, although she's talking about history, she's really talking about how people organise themselves. And people organise themselves in new ways, and people can organise themselves in new ways, and that's what I heard from what you said. I'm not sure if it's what you said, but it's what I heard. Thank you very much.